One of the other things that came out in this article was the idea that Neanderthals did mate sometimes with later humans, because we can see that in DNA evidence from some of the remains that have been found. So again, even if they do not evolve from the same line, you know, they have a common ancestor perhaps, but we see divergence in terms of, you know, how human beings develop. It didn't mean that there was no contact between these different human groups, because they could live together. They did mate at least occasionally, and we do have evidence of offspring who were, for lack of a better word, hybrids or combinations of DNA from these different groups. So they did have culture. They were nomadic. We know that. We know that they had basic clothing. We know that they had basic tools. We know that they had a varied diet. We know that they lived in lots of different places. Also, when the climate started to get much colder, when the climate change really started to set in, we know that the Neanderthals got pushed into more remote areas. Also, when you have more competition for resources with other more sophisticated groups of humankind coming in, that would have also relegated them to farther areas. All right, the next thing that I want to do briefly is talk about changes with the Neolithic era and the Agricultural Revolution, and how specifically that leads to the rise of cities, because those things really are very strongly connected. You have evolution there in terms of how societies develop. So first of all, how did the Agricultural Revolution begin? You have climate change because of the Ice Age, and as people are competing more for resources, they've got to find some other way to secure food other than following migratory patterns of animals, which were probably also beginning to change. So what happens? One of the ideas is that at these sites where they stay periodically, you have to imagine that as they're traveling, they tend to come back to some of the same places year after year. At some of these sites, you know, they have seeds that they're taking out of the food. You know, it's garbage. You throw the garbage on the ground. They come back, and where they've thrown all this stuff in the ground, you have plants growing. And they make those connections, and they say, oh, we could plant the food. So as they're coming back, they see that what they've done has had a result, and they start doing this on purpose. You know, what was accidental becomes on purpose. Now, that takes care of maybe how it started. How did it spread? Well, not every person, not every primitive example of humankind is going to come up with this idea at exactly the same moment. So when you have some groups that are becoming more sedentary, meaning they're staying in one spot, and other groups that are moving around, the groups moving around are coming into contact with the ones staying in one spot, and they go, oh, we can do that too. Let's go find some place by a river where we can have water and grow food and have animals and stuff. So ideas move. Ideas move because people move. And you see that happening. How did this, the Agricultural Revolution, lead to specialization? You have to know what specialization is before you can say how it happened. When people specialize, it means that they're not doing everything themselves. In other words, before specialization, everyone would have been involved in hunting and gathering. And why do we have this natural division of labor with men hunting and women gathering? One of the ideas is that women would have been slowed down by having to care for children, and it would have been easier for them under those circumstances not to be going out and hunting. That's one idea for how that happened. We go from a situation where everyone is hunting and gathering to farming, which means you have some people doing that, and it frees up time for other people to do other things. So now that we don't have everybody doing one thing, we can start splitting off into lots of different jobs. That's what specialization means. If you are a generalist, then that means you pretty much do a little bit of everything. If you're a specialist, it means you do what you're good at. Maybe it's one or two specific tasks. So we go from everybody hunting and gathering to farming, which then allows people to do other things. Now, how does that get us to social institutions? Okay, you have people staying in one place. You have a more constant food source. You can support a bigger population. More population means that you're going to start having more formalized systems of control. Maybe you go from the head of a small tribe to the head of a group of tribes. This is how governments develop. And you want to make sure that you're not equating the word institution with just government, because there are a lot of other things that are institutions. An institution is just a formalized system. We also start moving toward formal or state religions, where people are worshiping in one place or around one center, where you have maybe religion connected to the leader of the society. We're going to see areas in the world like that as we progress through the year.
To some extent, all societies begin as a family. Agriculture simply allows the size of that extended family to increase to the point where you now have a large group of interconnected people with a single cultural experience. Mm-hmm. That gives rise to institutions. That's just my take on that. Well, you didn't say family, and I think that's always been one of my. I've always thought that's one of the interesting points about it. But
well, I can hit that if you want me to.
I think it's worthwhile.
Okay.
You know, as another way to look at this.
Well, but that's one theory about how governments arise, actually.
Yeah.
Which I haven't talked about with them yet, but we can do that.
Well, if you haven't mentioned it with the students, don't do it.
Yeah, we talk about that in government. We don't really do that. Okay. So this chain of events we see happening in lots of different parts of the world. Now, in the chapter in your book, we focused on Sumerian culture with the city-state of Ur. Now, you're going to see a lot of characteristics here that are going to be very typical of civilizations as they develop all over the world. For example, specialization, which again means that people can do lots of different jobs. They're not all farming anymore. In particular, we look at artisans, or people who can create crafts. People who can do things that are not necessarily, absolutely necessary in a society, which allows them to do things like trade. When you have extra stuff, when you have things that are different that other groups of people aren't necessarily making, you trade. We see more advanced technology, because if they are staying in one spot, they can have more than they can carry. And it frees you up to develop lots of different things, because again, you've got a lot more time than when you were doing this every day of your life. And again, we see institutions develop, because when you have groups of families, groups of tribes, and the population gets bigger and bigger, you need to have some system of order. It's a natural human thing to want there to be a system of order. And there are different theories about how governments actually came about, but what we know for sure is that they did. Also, when you have specialization and you have trade, and we're not talking about trade with money, we're literally talking about barter, where you're trading one thing that you made for something that somebody else made. We're not talking about money yet. But when you have trade and you have large-scale business activity happening, people start wanting to keep records of it. Which is how we get to record keeping. Which is how we get to things like scribes, to inscribe something, to write it down. That's where this word comes from, scribes. And in Sumer, the alphabet that they're using on clay tablets, cuneiform. Wedge-shaped pictographic marks on clay tablets. This is how they kept records.